It is now being recorded. Okay, got it. Excellent. Right. So, yeah, I'll share my screen. A quick background. So, yes, I got the call yesterday from Angela saying, "Can you step in?" So here I am. And so what I've done is I've tried to pull out some relevant information from a much longer sort of deck and presentation that I do, which is a masterclass. I'll share my screen. I'll take you through that. Um, I have some demonstrations to keep things a little bit lively. And also, if you have any questions at all, please just pop them into the chat, and Angela or somebody will read them and then stop me, and we can have a chat about those things. I personally much prefer it when it's interactive, so yeah, do pipe up and ask questions. Um, I'm completely guessing as to exactly how long this is going to take because we literally put the agenda together well this morning, and I thought about what I could do that would be relevant for you. So I hope that it's going to be roughly an hour, and and that's with some demos and that sort of thing thrown in. If there's lots of questions, then I'm happy to answer those, and we might not get to some of the stuff towards the end. So, with that said, I will share my screen now. I know I'm going to put sound on just in case. I do have quite a high resolution screen, so that sometimes does cause an issue for people because they can't read what's on it. So, Angela, could you give me a nod if you can read that on my screen? Okay.
Yeah, it's not that clear to me, but
No,
I.
don't worry. That's fine. As long as you can. I'm not going to show you this. What I'm going to do. This is for me. This is my cheat sheet for what we're going to do. So this is what I put together as an outline for the talk. So I'll introduce myself, and it would be really helpful for me if you could tell me a little bit just by putting it into the chat, like what you know about generative AI already. So that will help me understand what sort of level that I should pitch at. So, I mean, you could start doing that now. That would be awesome. And then I'll do a short intro to generative AI. That's just sort of a table setting, so they're all on the same page about the core concept here of generative AI. Um, and then I'll talk a little bit about creativity over correctness. So anyone that's already used any generative AI tools will know that they're awesome at creating things, but they aren't necessarily correct in what they say and do. And so that I think is an important thing to discuss in this forum. Um, then I'll talk about some of the ways that we can mitigate some of these challenges. So I'll touch on human in the loop. I'll show you some examples of that actually inside of a technology, and it happens to be something that I'm building right now, which might be interesting, bit of a surprise for you. And then I'll try and show you some examples of generative AI in the context of quality. So I've just sort of done a bit of digging around and pulled out some demonstrations and examples that I think are relevant. Um, and then I'll just show you how I go about talking to organizations about risk and about governance. There's a lot of content in there, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but I will just show you and talk about it at a high level. Um, and the same thing for risks. Again, there's a lot to cover in risks. You probably know all of this already. You're probably worrying about it quite a lot already. I'll show you how I introduce the topic to organizations that I'm talking to. Okay, so I will get into it. I will be using a rather nice slide deck to do it. Has anyone put into the comments yet about their current level of interaction with generative AI? Oh, yes, they have. So Keith knows a little bit. Neil, limited knowledge, generated some documents. Yeah. Doris, not so much. Okay, Michael. Uh-huh. Okay, yeah, all right. So some you have some experience, like some exposure to generative AI. That's good. Right, let me do the sort of intro bit now. So this is me. What you're seeing on the left. Oh, and I'm not going to actually go through the slides and put them up on screen like a presentation because I'm going to jump about a bit here. But hopefully you can see it. You can see all the information. The slide builds aren't that important. But hopefully it's not too overwhelming. This is an introduction to me. This is the interesting bit is the bit on the left. This is a generated version of me from when I was 12. So this is an example of generative AI in action. I showed it a picture of me when I was 12, and it's brought me back to life. And I often show this to people because I think some people misunderstand like the nature of generative AI, and they see it as a kind of it's another step in technology. It's just like all the previous systems we've had, only it does some other clever things like generate text. But in actual fact, generative AI is a much more creative, and the clue's in the name, generative, a much more creative tool set, has a lot of interesting capabilities that are worth knowing about and can be leveraged in business and in the context of quality. To know about me, I've been in and around the tech space for many, many years, far too many to specify in a slide. But I've built lots of products. I've run lots of projects, and I've run 3 different companies in the tech space. I've had a lifelong interest in AI. And now with generative AI, it's much more accessible and useful to a much wider range of people. So I've got back into it, and I've doubled down, and I've started my own company again in the generative AI space. This is another example of generative AI in action.
Hello, and thanks for joining Jonathan and I for this talk. We hope you enjoy it and that nothing unexpected, sinister, or scary happens at all.
Right. I'm not going to go through all of this, but because I'm going to try and skip through and get through as much as I can. The reason I show this to people is to demonstrate something. So I ask them how many avatars they see, how many generated avatars they see. And in fact, all of the video, and including me in this picture, in this video here, it's all generated. And this hints at another thing, which is the sort of concept of creating deep fakes, and the implications of that are with us already. Setting up this video took and creating this avatar of me and producing this avatar speaking through this script probably took me the best part of half a day. The bit that took longer was actually generating the aliens, and the other weird avatars in this demonstration. But creating deep fakes or avatars, duplicates, is actually really quite straightforward these days. So you just be slightly cautious, but also perhaps entertained about that. Right. I'll very quickly skip through this, just so if you get into any conversations about AI, there's a lot of terminology. The things that are probably worth knowing are that the modern form of AI is basically labeled machine learning, and what that means is instead of us programmatically telling a machine to do something, we're teaching it how to learn, then we're asking it to learn, and then we're using the output of its learning. So that's what machine learning is. And there are various sort of evolutions of that. And where we are right now is with these generative pre-trained transformers. So if you've used Chat GPT, you'll recognize the GPT in the name here. And that simply means generative pre-trained transformer. I'm gonna draw this towards why it's relevant quality in just a second. Basically, these models are very, very large databases that are driven by language. They understand and they process language, which makes them much easier for us to interact with. But fundamentally, they are literally just billions and billions of parameters that sit inside a data store, and then we interact with them, and that has implications. The tool sets are very capable of generating. They generate stuff very fast. So they output language, they output video, they can output images. And this is where it sort of has a sort of interesting dovetailing with quality, in that they're very good at generating. They're not so awesome at QAing what they generate. And that means, well, it has all sorts of implications, but one of the common things you might have heard about generative AI is that it can hallucinate. And what that basically means is it can make stuff up. So when we're using generative AI tools in the context of a workplace, we need to be very careful about how we use them. We need to be careful about how we implement them, and we need to have guardrails in place to make sure that the wheels don't completely fall off. And you might have heard some of the horror stories, but there have been many situations in which generative AI has been used badly, and has caused all sorts of problems, even in law courts or courts of law. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The other elements here of these GPTs are they are pre-trained. So that means that they can reason, they have access to a lot of knowledge. And I hate doing this, but when I say reason, I don't mean they are reasoning like a human reason. I mean, it's similar, but they're certainly not conscious. And they have memory. And what that means is that there's a whole lot of data stored inside them. I'm going to skip over the transformer bit for now, but that is basically just one of the ways in which they have improved dramatically over the last sort of few years, which means they've become much more popular and easier to use. So you might hear that language. I hope that's a reasonable explanation. I think the most important thing in this context is this capacity to generate. And as they generate new things, they are not innately taught to QA themselves, and that does cause problems. Right. Here's a quick overview. It's probably this slide might be worth you having actually, but basically there are a bunch of core capabilities, core things that generative AI bring to the table, which we can use in building of solutions, and just using them day to day. And those are these. They have the capacity to reason, and they have access to a lot of knowledge. I've already touched on that. They're a broad or general technology, so they will adapt, and they can personalize. So that means if you tell a chat GPT to act like a judge in court, it will try and do that for you. If you tell it there's an expert in quality, it will try and be an expert in quality, and it will give you different types of output based on that. That's very unusual for a technology. Most technology systems don't behave differently because you ask them to. I've already touched upon the fact that you can generate lots of different types of media. So images, text, videos, music. They can turn their hand to all sorts of different media. They can generate new concepts, and I think this is something that's slightly surprising to people. They're very good at combining different knowledge sets into new concepts. So they're not just going back to a database and bringing back data. They've got the capacity to generalize and to reason based on that data to come up with new concepts. So they are being used for sort of R&D, and you can use them for brainstorming and that sort of thing. And I've already mentioned that the primary way in which we interact with them is through natural language. So we can talk to them. And I do have an example I might do a bit later if I have time. Okay. Right. So that's just an introduction to generative AI. Angela, are there any questions about any of that? You were so engrossed you didn't look.
There we go. I was. I love this because I've heard you speak before. There was one thing that came up, an interesting comment from Neil.
Why should I do that?
Go on.
It was an interesting comment from Neil about people cloning themselves to attend Teams meetings, which I thought was quite amusing.
Yes.
But there was a concern about energy consumption and environmental impact. And that's interesting because I remember attending a talk about the different power consumptions, the different algorithms. So maybe you'd like to address the environmental.
I can have a crack at that. So, they do. So the training and running of AI models takes a large amount of energy. But so do lots of other things. So the question should really be, what is the value that it delivers, and does that value equate to the amount of energy that it takes? And I sort of think about that because I'm obviously, a bit of a fan of AI. I think about that. If you think about the amount of power that data centers in general take, it's quite a lot. So we imagine some of the measures, it's like that, it's the same as a small country. Um, and most of that is dedicated to things that are not AI. So that would be running your Microsoft 365, Google and all its searches, Netflix, Amazon, all of those. And a small fraction of that is generative AI. So it does have an impact. The impact will reduce, but it's pretty high at the moment, because the technology is pretty young. So it's really more about what is the value that it offers. And I mean, lots of things that we do take up energy. So yeah, and it's being addressed, but it is recognized as an issue. My personal view is that I think it's going to go away because most people are concerned about the finances of it rather than the energy consumption of it. So, like all of I mean, I am an advocate for for AI and generative AI, but I'm quite aware that it's not all good news. We're not today. We won't touch on sort of the economic impacts of all of this, but they can. There is some disruption coming, and that is not going to be good for everybody. So it's not all good news when it comes to generative AI. But I'm looking on the bright side, and I'm going to tell you the good things. All right. Uh, Anything else, or shall I move on?
No, that's it for now, Luke.
All right, very good. So, here is the way that I try and explain the nature of generative AI, and I think a lot of people like really don't get this. So one of the common things that I see when I go into organizations is this compartmentalizing of generative AI in their business as something to do with IT. And so they delegate its sort of use and development to IT. And I don't think that is the right thing to do. I'm going to talk, if we get a chance, I'll introduce you to what I suggest in terms of how organizations should think about governance and management of generative AI as a phenomena. But I don't think the right answer is to push it into IT. And the reason I don't think that is I think that people are making the mistake of thinking that generative AI is just like like previous generations of technology. And the reason it's not is because most of the use cases, not all, but most of the use cases associated with generative AI are not something connected with the technology or the technology department or function. Um, Generative AI, as I've kind of sort of touched on already, is much more generative and creative. So it generates videos, like you saw a minute ago. It can reanimate me from when I was 12. I can interact with it. I can talk to it. So those are not those sort of use cases are not really the same use cases that you would say if I don't know if you were implementing I don't know if you were using Microsoft 365. It's a different style of application. Its front end, the way we interact with it is language. So that bypasses the need for code regularly. And it can reason, so we can talk to it. It can help us work through problems. And so it's not rigid. Uh, it's very generalist. So I can talk to an AI about, which I do regularly, what I should make for dinner. And I can also talk to it about sort of how I should write code. And it's able to respond to me about both of those things. And again, that's not normal for a technology to be able to do that. So I pitch this, or I talk about this as being generative AI being right-brained, creative, perhaps a little bit flaky, as opposed to logical and left-brained. And this is the way I try and get the picture or the metaphor across to people so they can understand it better. So there are several downsides to this. So traditional technologies, well-established technologies, are really good at running processes, doing the same thing in and out every time. They're very predictable. Hopefully they work all the time. Sometimes they don't, they break, but that's an aside. Whereas generative AI, you can ask it the same question and it might give you a different answer. It's injected into different systems in different ways, and that has different ramifications. And underlying all of this are these models, and we don't like they're black boxes. We don't know exactly how they generate the answers that they do. So we know how they get trained. We can test them for certain outputs, but we don't know exactly. They're not deterministic in that they don't just go through a set of steps and then give us an answer. And there are lots of implications for that about this when it comes to quality control. And I'm gonna talk about how I think about this when I'm running projects. I won't talk about it in the context of standards, but I will talk about how I can use technology to help with that problem, and also how we can use project processes to help with that as well. So this illustrates where I think some of the magic is in this crossover between existing technologies and then this new capability, this new capacity that generative AI brings us. Um, these are just the same kind of attributes that I've been talking about so far. You can obviously use those independently. So you could be using a chat GPT. If you're a Microsoft house, you might now be seeing the magic button, and that will get you access to Copilot. If you're using Google Suite, then you'll almost certainly be seeing the magic button, which gives you access to Gemini. Those are the sort of underlying models. I think there is a whole new sector that's going to arise, which is this crossover between existing technologies and then the new talents and capacities of generative AI. And this is where I spend quite a lot of time working, is in how do we inject these new talents into our existing technologies. So it could be anything from I want to create a spreadsheet, and maybe I'll show you the example if I get time. I want a spreadsheet, and I want that spreadsheet to be able to transfer transform this unstructured text to some kind of structured text. I might want it to do some sentiment analysis. I might want to summarize it, and I can do that inside of a spreadsheet. So it's been bringing new capacities to existing technologies. Um, Another way to think about it is it might bring entire new interfaces. So let's say you're in Excel and you don't know how to write a formula. You could be talking to it and saying, how do I create a formula that counts all of the R's in the last sentence? And it will then it knows how to do it. So the AI knows how to do it, and it will generate the formula for you, and it will put it into the spreadsheet for you. So there's all sorts of new ways that you can deploy these kinds of talents, and I think that's where there's going to be some really interesting developments in the not too distant future. So, sort of to recap all of that, I think in this forum, the interesting thing is that generative AI is optimized for creating. It's not optimized for any form of quality control. That means that when we implement it, when we use it, we have to be careful with it. And in your roles, there is a definite need for someone to be saying, right, what are the implications of this? Like, what's going to happen if we just start deploying these systems? And I'll come back to a list of sort of risks that you might want to consider later on. And as I said, I'll talk about some project processes, the sort of things that I do, and how we keep humans in the loop and that sort of thing to provide some oversight for that.
Thanks, Luke. There are a couple of questions that are coming into the chat if you want them.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So Ian mentioned at an appropriate point, could you talk about the importance of explainable AI? And Neil raised ISO 42001, obviously, which is the AI management system, which is, where you've got now, which is talking about establishing it, implementing it, maintaining it, maybe improving it, and the control aspect, if you're familiar with that standard.
Right. Okay. I'm not familiar with that standard, but I can probably address it slightly. Generally, the standards, the ones that I've seen, and I'm not an expert, I should say that up front, but the ones that I've seen address the model builders, and I think that's a fine place to start. They talk about some of the biases in the data and data sources and people stealing information from other people, and I generally do implementation. So really, the there's only a handful of model builders, and so they build the foundational models. And I mean, so I mean, literally, what not that's not fair. There's several, but the big boys are OpenAI, and then Google, Meta. So that's the guys behind Facebook and WhatsApp. And then there's the European contingent is a group called Anthropic in Paris, I think they are. Um, and then sort of, and I've mentioned Google. Microsoft is sort of getting into the game now, but they're generally hosting other people's. So from what I'm aware, most of the standards are about model generation, and that's one segment of the use of like most of the use of generative AI is actually by consumers rather than by builders. So yeah, I think there needs to be a whole bunch of other regulation about its use. I think that would be very difficult to police, but yeah, that probably needs to be addressed.
Yeah. I just respond to that quickly, very quickly, Luke, and say that 42001 is very much aimed at organisations using AI rather than developing it.
Is it?
So yeah, we did have a speaker about it previously. So yeah, worth a look.
Okay. Yeah.
Very interested in your thoughts on it.
Is it? No, let's not go into that. Yes, I would be interested
Yeah.
to see it. Yeah. Let's shelve it for now, but definitely would be interested to find out more. Right.
And the other question
Oh, yes.
was about the importance of explainable AI.
Yes. So there's projects going on now so people are trying to build sort of technology that that sort of peers into how the processing occurs in these models, and I don't know how well that is going. I think explainability is still a problem. Actually knowing how it comes up with answers consistently. So you can break it down and say, well, the training data looked like this. Or you can do it in reverse and say it's come up with this answer because of these parameters. But it's still not. It's not a good state of affairs. The sort of slightly ironic thing about this is that, well, with one of the strengths of it is its capacity to generate stuff, and we generate new stuff which we hadn't thought about before. And then we kind of want it to explain itself about how it did that, and that's quite hard. So, but there are tools that you can get. So I was doing a bit of work with a tool called Data IQ recently, and it has sort of explainability built in. But what it's really doing is it's saying, there was some training parameters, and therefore that's how we got to this result, and it kind of ignores what happened in the generative model in the middle. So yeah, I think it's still, I think, it's an area that as quality professionals, someone needs to drill into. Again, it's what I do is I run project processes to work out how well it's performing. And I do it by trial and error. And that's how it works for me. All right. They were sort of vague answers. I hope that and there's much more to mine into that, I'm sure. But that's as much as I can manage now. Right. Right. So I'm gonna get off the slides now, and I'll show you a simplified mechanism that I sometimes use. And so this. Don't worry about too much about what's on this, right? This is a workflow application that I use to implement solutions. And I'll show you how it's relevant. But what I often do when I'm building something is there'll be a workflow. In this case, there's a bunch of data that I'm accessing. And then I've got agents. Right, very quickly. Agents are basically just small tools that use the sort of reasoning capacity of generative AI along with other tools, and they call the other tools when they need to do something. So you may know that generative AI is not very good at doing calculations. So great at language, not so great at maths. Right. So a good example of an agent is basically you give it a calculator and you say, do this calculation for me, Mr. Agent. The agent recognizes that it needs to use a calculator because it doesn't know how to do maths. It calls the calculator and then does the calculation for you, and then it gives you the result. So that's a really simple example of what an agent might do. And you can attach all sorts of tools to agents, and you can build them into workflows. So that means you can build quite complicated, complex, rich workflows using these kind of tools. This example, what this example is pulling some data, it's doing some clever things, and then it's outputting data. So I won't explain any more detail than that. But the useful thing in here is I'm using an agent to supervise another agent. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting some information. So basically I'm passing in some company names and that sort of stuff. And I'm asking my agent to go browse the web and to come back to me with information that is relevant. And then I'm going to give that information to someone else. So this is just a repetitive task that this company does on a regular basis. And I'm taking away the difficulty. This tool set is taking away the difficulty of running that task. But the problem with that is we need to know how good the result is before we give it to the people that are going to take action on it, because it could be poor or it could be wrong. Now, there's a low chance of that being true, but it's possible. And so this is how I try and build guardrails into technology-based solutions. And that's this agent here. All it's doing is supervising this agent here. And what that means is it's looking at the output and it's saying, I think it's good or bad. So I've given it a set of parameters to work with to understand whether an output is good or bad. I'll show you briefly, but again, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. But basically, I've given it a rule set and I've said to it, I want you to judge whether or not this output is good. And the first way it's going to do it is it's going to double check by going back to the web and say, is it there? Like, did you really find it? And if it doesn't, it will throw an error and it will say, no, that's not good enough. Go do it again. And then it will rank or score the output based on a bunch of formulas I've given it. So it doesn't really matter what they are. But the important thing to know is I can create, and this is what happens relatively often in builds, is I can create an AI to do something. And as part of the workflow, I also create the quality control checking to make sure that the first agent is doing its job. Another setup that we often use is what's called a multitude of experts. So we've got one agent here that is doing something. And in fact, I will build this into this application a bit later. I've got one agent. I've got one agent that does one task, one agent that does another task, and then I'll have another agent that's like an editor that looks at those two tasks and like combines them based on what it thinks is the best outcome. So building these workflows, all these chains, and in this case, there's a quality decision maker here, and what it's doing is it's looking at the output from my supervisor, and it's saying, I think that's good enough, or it's not good enough. And if it's not good enough, it iterates back around the loop, and it basically sends the homework back to the first agent and says, do it again. And then it runs around the loop. And so I have to make sure it doesn't turn into an infinite loop. But this is one way that you can impose quality controls inside of an application. So one of the questions I get the most is or questions, feedback, is I've tried it, it doesn't work, right? I've tried it, it gave me a terrible answer. And what I generally say to people is, well, first of all, how did you prompt it? What was the process that you used to try and get an answer? Secondly, how did you quality control what it was going to do? And usually the answer to both of those questions is, oh, I just typed in a string of text and it was rubbish. And I say, well, you need to learn how to use these tools properly. And the two things that you can do are you can learn how to prompt well. So, for example, you might give an AI examples of the sorts of things that you want, and it will get much better at providing the right kind of answer to you. And the second thing is you need to quality control the output somehow. And you can do it inline like I've done it, or you could literally get the output from the string of text that it's given you if you're using a chat GPT, and you can say to it, please double check your answer, and it will go away and double check its answer. So, you know, that you can build quality control into your own processes as well. Okay, so that's what I call a sort of technology solution for trying to impose some sort of quality control into a solution that I might build. Angela, any questions on that?
Nothing at the moment. So
Okay,
all
all
well.
right. Okay, so I'll move on. I'm gonna skip over that because yeah. Yeah, there's a demo I can do. I might come back to it later on because it's kind of interesting. But we'll see. Preparing right. I'm going to assume that people don't know what a custom GPT is, and then I'm going to do a bit of an explanation about that, and then I'll try and show you some custom GPTs. So this slightly more sophisticated process can be built into. So if you've got a paid version of OpenAI's ChatGPT, you can sort of build this sort of thing into it, and I'm going to show you how to do that. It's not strictly going to go through this kind of looping process, but it's just a much more sophisticated way of using ChatGPT. Right, let me go into this. So this is ChatGPT. You've probably seen this before. I happen to have a paid version of ChatGPT, so I have these sorts of options over here. I obviously have a long history of things that I've been talking to ChatGPT about. So a GPT or like a custom GPT, very unhelpfully called a My GPTs inside of ChatGPT, which is a bit of a mouthful. What that allows you to do is customize the way you're using ChatGPT in this case. And I'm going to drill into that so you know a little bit about how to do this. In your circumstances are quite likely to be a bit more, your requirements are quite likely to be a bit more sophisticated than sort of base use of things like ChatGPT, whereas a custom GPT might be really useful for you. And I'll sort of explain why. Inside of a custom GPT, it's using exactly the same back-end technology. It's using these generative AI models in the back end. What we're doing is we're putting a layer over the top of it that sort of controls or refines the way that it works. And this is one way to just sort of to put some filters on it, to make it follow patterns, to do things that you want it to do. So if you're worried about, which you probably should be, people in organizations just going out and using ChatGPT to do whatever they do day to day, this is one way that you can add value by putting some controls over the top of it. It configures what ChatGPT will do, makes it more useful, and also puts some elements of control in. The way this works is I give it a name and description. They don't do anything, but they do appear on the screen, so that's helpful for the user. But I provide it instructions. So this, in this case, so when we started talking about quality yesterday, Angela, I did this. I built a little GPT, and I've said to it, I want you to mimic being a quality consultant, right? So you're a highly qualified quality consultant. That gives it context, and it will actually modify the way it responds to you, which is a bizarre thing about generative models, but that's what they do. I've told it to be lighthearted and humorous so that its responses are slightly lighthearted and humorous, but I've also told it that it needs to understand these specific things. So it will look for those and it will work out what they mean. It probably already knows. It's probably already in its parameter database. The more modern, the more up to date or updates into those standards, it may not know, but it will go and try and find them by going to the web to understand them. So I'm directing it to say this is the knowledge that's important. These are the kinds of things that you do day to day. That will also give it examples of what topics it should cover. And I've told it needs to understand stuff about risk in generative AI. because I'm talking about generative AI, and that just helps. It gives it some direction. So I'm putting filters and controls over the top of what it will do, and I'm giving it context, and I'm also telling it, I've given it document, I've given it knowledge, and you can upload knowledge in all sorts of different formats to all of the most of the front end generative AI tools. So, you know, that could be a spreadsheet, it could be a file, it could be a PDF like I've uploaded here. It could be a database that you're linking it to. And then the model will know, it will understand what's in that database. In this case, my custom GPT can also go browse the web. So I've told it about those ISO standards. It will go look for them if it needs information about them. I've also allowed it to generate images, which probably is not so relevant. But I've also allowed this code interpreter allows it to create documents, to interpret code, and that sort of thing. So this is a customized version. The easiest way to customize a generative AI tool if you're a non-technical user. You're literally giving it instructions in language, no writing code. You're uploading documents to provide it instructions, to give it some knowledge, and you're giving it access to the web. So it's not difficult to do. I build these quite a lot just to show people how it works, and then I generally build solutions in other platforms that are slightly more technical. So let's have a play with this one. I've got a couple of prompts which I'm going to ask it. I'll keep it up in this form. Generally speaking, obviously, I wouldn't be showing the configuration elements of it when we're using it. So here's a prompt. I'm considering building a Gen AI tool that finds new customers that have the same profile as my existing customers. What should I worry about? So hopefully it's going to come back with an answer that's relevant in the quality world. In this case, I've given it some instructions, I've given it some data, and it's saying, right, these are the things you should worry about: data privacy and compliance, bias and fairness, data quality, overfitting of models, transparency and explainability. There you go. So these are the things you've already talked about. So I've told it to wear a hat, I've given it information, and then I've told it what I'm going to do, and it's coming back with some reasonable answers, and it's told me which standard. Is that right? I don't know whether that's right or not, whether that's the standard that I should be focusing on. So I'm molding this GPT to know and think and act like a quality professional. So here's another prompt. Tell me more about privacy and compliance standards. So they've been mentioned up here. And again, I'm not, apart from this, telling it that it needs to know about these things, I haven't given it any particular information. But it is able to coach me on what I should worry about when it comes to privacy and compliance. So this is either going, and again, I don't know which, it's either going to its own parameter memory, its data store, or I've given it license to go to the web to go and get this information. So I wanted to show you that because that is an example of how you can clamp down a bit on the function of, in this case, ChatGPT, but most of the other popular tools do the same sorts of things by giving it parameters and ways to think. That means that it will act in a slightly different way. And so that might help you stay and your team stay more compliant. And I wanted to show you that because you don't have to write any code to do this. It's just a step that you can take. I think Neil has a question.
Yeah, I mean, it's what you've got there. You know, it looks good on sort of first reading. I mean, you know, I would say, you know, 27001 is an information security rather than data privacy standard. There is a standard 27701, which is a data privacy extension to 27001. So it's not picking that up yet. But obviously, these things, as you say, they learn over time. So it may have not learned of the existence of that standard, and it's, you know, I'm not sure what level of take up we are with that. But that's where, yeah, that's where you know, I've always noticed you'll get one or two little sort of areas that you have to manually tweak when you work with these.
Right.
Yeah.
So keep going with this, right? All I did was give it one PDF and some instructions. Now, I could have loaded up all of these standards. Oh, are they down here? Is that the ones you were talking about?
Yeah, I saw it there. I think you went up and it mentioned 27701. Yeah, there you
Yeah,
go. Yeah.
yeah. So I haven't taught it anything, right? But if I was doing this properly and not for like a demo that I hacked together yesterday, right? I would probably give it the standards and I would say, you're an expert and you must know everything that is in these documents. And it would know pretty reliably. So it's done okay. But I would never, I often do these demos and they're a bit half-assed, to be honest, but I'm trying to make them relevant and therefore I knock something together quickly so it's on the right topic. But that doesn't mean that this would be like a production system. It just means I'm trying to make it roughly on topic for the discussion. It would take longer to build something that was better than this. And as I say, I wouldn't use a chat GPT for a sort of project, really. Right. Uh, okay. The other thing, so another use of these sorts of agents that might be useful for you is this ability to compare. So I'm imagining a scenario in your case. I hope it's relevant. That is, let's say you're looking at a company's policies, and you have to compare them to a standard and say whether or not they're suitable. um, I was talking to another company about this relatively recently. They were saying it's an absolute nightmare for them because they're a financial services company, so they have to be FCA compliant, and regulations change, and then they have to go back to all of their policies and procedures and work out whether or not they are compliant, then modify them. And so we're working on a way for them to automate some of that. And the way they can do that is by they teach the model two things. They teach it their own policies and procedures, and they teach it the legislation. And then when there's a change to the legislation, they teach it the new legislation and they ask it to go back to their policies and procedures and point out where they are no longer suitable. So it's like it's quite a meaty task, and you have to be quite careful with it. But I wanted to show you something similar, and this is another like assistant that I've got. Again, it uses OpenAI at the back end, but this is an extrapolated front end, and it's in a system called Flowwise, but that's neither here nor there. And what I've done is I've taught it what our policies are, and then I'm going to ask it a couple of questions. So it knows. So I'm pretending I'm a person, I'm a user of a system, and I just want to know about our policies and procedures. So I built tools that do this as well, which are basically you learn the policies and procedures. People get onboarded. They are told all about the policies and procedures, but then some circumstance occurs and they need to have an answer. They don't want to necessarily trawl through all of them. And what I've done in this case is I've uploaded some example policies and procedures, and I've asked it a question. What should I do if it's rude to reject a gift? In this case, one of the policies and procedures is my anti-bribery policy, and it's told me exactly what I need to know by going through those policies and then finding me the answer. So this is not a keyword search. It hasn't looked for rude or rejected or gift. It's understood the concept, and then it's gone through the policies and procedures, found the right document, and it's told me what I need to do as according to our own policies and procedures. I don't often get gifts, so that probably doesn't worry me too much. But I can take that to the next step. So I could sort of take a meta point of view and ask it another question based on the fact that it knows more than just about my policies and procedures. It has this sort of data store of knowledge in the first place. And I can ask it this question. So how could I improve my data protection policy? What is missing? So to enhance, and bear in mind that this is example data, so I'm expecting it to have issues. So to enhance Ultra Group's data protection policy, consider introducing including specific sections on data privacy by design, data protection impact assessments, and training. Now, you will know better than I do whether that is correct or not, but they sound like sensible things to me. So basically, again, it's gone through the documentation, it's read the documentation, it already understands something about data protection, and it's providing me some advice. Now, again, going back to the previous point, you have to be careful when you're doing this. It has to be taught. They have to know. You have to double check the answers. And I'm gonna talk now about the sort of process that I follow to make sure that that happens when I'm running projects, because the last thing we want is to build a solution and that solution to give the wrong answers. So let's skip on to that. Angela, any questions on any of that?
No questions yet.
Okay, right. Okay. So, as has already been pointed out, so I pointed out and other people on the call have pointed it out, one of the key issues with generative AI is that it can produce the wrong answers, right? So, and I've looked at one way that we can provide a sort of technology safety net for that, but that on its own is not enough, obviously. So when I run projects, I follow a process that's a little bit like this. And you can see here, like these sorts of shields here are supposed to illustrate how much confidence at any one point in the project lifecycle we would have in the solution. So generally speaking, project life cycles, technology project life cycles, they focus on the build of a solution. Like, we assume it's going to work as we built it, and then we ask users to tell us whether or not it's actually doing what they want it to do. So we have a testing process. But in this case, we've got another variable, which is that we don't know exactly how the generative AI is going to respond, because it might respond differently to different questions and differently in different circumstances and so on. And so we need to build that new dimension into our project process to make sure, or at least to minimize the potential issues with that. And to address some of the quirky stuff that we just saw, like it not saying the right thing about ISO standards. And so the way to do that is sort of follow this life cycle. So bottom left here, this is a very nascent stage of building a generative AI solution. First of all, we'd do some solution design, and that's fairly conventional. We'd work out, what it is that it needs to do. We'd work out what problem it's solving. We'd ask people if it acted in a certain way, would that address the problem, and so on. I would then do a mock-up of that in a shortcut that to be able to see if we really think that generative AI has a crack at solving this problem. Because often it doesn't, and we should stop. Often it does, and therefore we can keep going with the project. And one of the ways I do that is by using things like custom GPTs, which I just showed you, because it's quick and we can see if we're going to get approximately the right outcome from a generative AI tool. So I can mock it up. I can see if I think it's going to work. Can see if it's completely bizarre or whether it's actually doing the right thing. And I can put some parameters around it using a custom GPT, and that says, well, okay, well, we think we're on the right path here, so let's keep moving. And then I would build something much more usable. So I showed you that example here of this sort of in workflow. So we can use no-code environments to do this, and how that has some sort of quality control or testing elements inside of it. And so that's a kind of starting point for building a usable solution. So that's still not going to guarantee that it's completely correct. But what it is going to do is it's going to get us to the point where we can test it and it's not embarrassing. So like, we can actually put it in front of people, usually testers, usually a select group of people, and we can say, can you try this and see what and you tell me as the expert whether this is working or not. So it's not just about usability, it's about correctness and confidence in the solution we're building. And that is like the first step in the process. Sometimes, assuming that goes well, we would then move up here and we would start getting like non-internal project people using the application. So we would then put it in front of, say, operators inside a business. So if a scenario is it's a customer support tool. What we would do is we'd give access to the customer support Q&A tool to the support agent, the support operator, not to the end customer. And we would say, right, you use it, and every time someone asks you a question, type it in, see what the answer looks like. Right? If the answer is useful, great. If it's not, you tell us, and we'll try and work out how to make the system better. So we're going through a very fast iterative process to try and knock out the bugs and issues with the responses that a generative AI tool is giving us. So this is a different approach to how we would normally implement a sort of more traditional or established technology, because we don't expect it to give us variable outcomes. Assuming that goes well, we would do some productization of it. So we're ironing out the bugs all the way, but we might improve the user interfaces. We might put some other strict guardrails in place, like we wouldn't allow it to respond to certain questions, for example, that sort of thing. And that is all, it's just ratcheting up the level of quality, minimizing the kind of errors and output that we don't want, and moving towards having a system that we can then put in front of a third party. So that could either be a customer or a client, or or the general public, wherever it's going to be used. And the important point is we've gone through a fairly long process where it's been in front of human users, in front of humans for a long time, before we give access to people that are not on like the inside of the project. So this life cycle is different because of the nature of generative AI and the way it responds and the way it acts. I'm going to talk about one more thing, but any questions before I do that?
Nothing coming up at the moment, Nick.
All right. Okay. It's gone 8, so I'll talk about this very briefly. I'll just show you a glimpse of the sort of framework that I use, or I advocate for, at least with organizations, whether they use it or not. One of the things I often hear is people saying, I can't use it because it doesn't give me the perfect outcome. And that makes me assume that what they're doing is they feel like they have to listen to the output of a generative AI, which is should never happen, right? So right at the center here, full autonomy, giving any AI full autonomy or believing its answer without questioning it is just the wrong thing to do. There seems to be an assumption that that is the only thing you can do, but you should just never do that. And I've talked about a couple of ways that you can put in error checking already. And if you're just simply prompting, send the information back to the same AI and ask it to do it again, or ask it to check its own homework, right? And it will do that quite reliably. Anyway, so here's a sort of portfolio or spectrum of different types of human in the loop that I suggest gets used. Right over here on the left-hand side, there's human only, where we're not really using generative AI at all. Given that Microsoft and everybody else now has generative AI in their own applications, that is becoming less common. There's lower uptake in the UK, and certainly quite a lot lower uptake in the UK than there is in the US at the moment for generative AI in all ways, but I think that will change relatively swiftly. And over here on the right-hand side, we've got like an AI-only scenario, which is obviously in red. And I've showed you a way we can get AI to check AI. I think that is the minimum scenario that anyone should have, but probably going back across these options is a better idea in most circumstances. So we can have humans that audit the outputs. So that would be the same as any audit process. They would pick a sample of those outputs and they would look at them and say whether it's doing the right thing or not. We might build into a process the ability to look at exceptions. So that might come from feedback. So that might be, I don't know, like someone looked up something in their policy and they can't find it, but it was actually in there. That would be flagged as an exception. We try and work out what happened. That happens in live scenarios. Humans do it as well. It might be that humans have to approve any answers that come out of a system before they get seen by anybody else. So you can see basically here, it's going from a scenario which it's it's all people and all teams, to a scenario in which it's 90%, whatever the scenario is, 90% automated or augmented by generative AI. And the big takeaway from this is there seems to be this idea that we should just hand everything over to AI, and the result, we should just trust the results, and we shouldn't do that. We should think about how we keep humans in the loop at all times, and so I spend quite a lot of time telling people how to do that, either through the process I've just shown you, if it's a project, or if it's just a workflow, talking to them about how humans need to be involved for quality and other reasons. Right. Last thing is I wanted to show you, where is it? Not this one, this one. Okay. So what I'm seeing at the moment, I'm talking to a lot of organizations about generative AI and generative AI tools and systems. And I'm seeing a lot people tinkering with tools like ChatGPT and Gemini and in Google Suite and Copilot in Microsoft, and they're kind of feeling their way, trying to work out about what is this generative AI thing, or they're delegating it to an IT department, or and the problem with that approach was multifold, but is there's very little strategic thought going into and governance going into how are we going to use this technology? Are we going to use this technology? Should we use this technology? It's people kind of piecemeal using it to do various things across their organizations and usually their own tasks. That can lead to technology proliferation. It can lead to mistakes and problems. So I generally advocate for putting in place a simple, what I would pitch as a special interest group, and that group should be sort of pulled from different reasonably senior people in an organization, and they should come together and they should be the sort of specialists. They should generate their own knowledge or have someone like me teach them about generative AI, so that they are informed about the whole topic and what impact it might have on their business, other organization. And they should carry out these functions. They should put in place specific guardrails, and that might include the standards. And if they're financially regulated, then they'll have to worry about those too. But they're responsible for making sure there are guardrails in the business that everybody follows when they're using generative AI, whether that's a project that someone's building, something, or a tool set an off-the-shelf tool set that somebody's using. So primary thing they're responsible for. The next thing is understanding how the technology can be used, and then right now, because not very many people know this stuff, working out how their organization should benefit, or the likely threats that they need to do something about, they need to address. And so they would be overseeing initiatives that there's an organization they want to run, and hopefully that stops the spawning of hundreds of different small sort of micro projects happening inside the organization. And then providing oversight, so sponsorship and then oversight for those individual projects, because at the moment, I've just shown some ways that we can police these projects, but most people are not used to running that kind of process, and so it needs to be enforced somehow, and there needs to be measures about the success and the appropriateness of the project and that sort of thing. So they would oversee those projects, and then finally they would be looking externally. So what's going on in the market? Is it just disruption? Are our competitors doing something based on generative AI that we should know about and we should be responding to? And so I advocate for the setting up of these kinds of sort of senior groups with these that do these kinds of activities, and that hopefully provides some control over what an organization is doing with generative AI and reduces the sort of randomness and hopefully the errors in what's happening day to day. Right. I have got plenty of other sort of topics and things we could talk about. I have been talking quite a long time and my voice is about to go. So, Andrea, any questions? Anything I can answer? Yeah.
There's no further questions in the chat. But yeah, really like that governance model at the end. But you know, we can open the floor to Q&A at the end if anyone's got questions, and bring voices in. But I would just like to say thank you, because that was a lot of information, a really good overview, and certainly got people thinking. Ian's got his hand up, so do you want to come in with a question, Ian?
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting. Thank you very much, Luke. Very, very interesting. It sparked off a few ideas. My question is about your life cycle, in terms of how different, if at all, is that from the sort of standard agile project life cycle?
Right. So, where is it? So the key new element to this is that is this. Well, I say new element. So it's the sort of trust level. So if you think about, I built lots of systems, and generally what we're trying to do is we're trying to make them function consistently in a way that solves a problem, and we're trying to make them usable so that users actually like them and can use them, because if they don't, they just won't use them. And those are the sort of correctness and usability are the main ways that we drive testing of systems. This is a new element which I label trust or confidence, which is just a new dimension to think about when running these kinds of projects. I've tried to find a graphic that kind of illustrates this break between. Sometimes this gets called a lighthouse project, where you run something internally, but you don't give it over to external users until not just it's been tested and approved, but there's a certain confidence level by a user set inside of the business. So it's, in terms of the sort of iterative methodology, it's not that different. We're just adding in a new dimension, which you might call it a success criteria for a project. You know, and there might be a metric where we say, you know, we poll our internal users at the end of every week, and we say, okay, in your opinion, is it ready? You know, is it safe? And then, you know, they will have opinion. And that, yeah, that could be a metric needed in place to try and measure this sort of level of trust or confidence.
Thank you. If anything, it seems to be an enhancement of what I would call true agile, because you're introducing the AI element, as you say, to improve the trust of the final output, which is much more critical where you're relying on this new sort of technology. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, you can actually use AI for testing, for, you know, for example, through data generation, through through testing for gaps that people can't, the coverage level. There's lots of other things you can use it for, but in this case, it's more about that trust level of the user or the organization than it is about the sort of correctness of the process of the technology.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Michael, you've got your hands up.
Hi, yeah. So one of the things my organization is very keen to do is to explore what's possible. But I recognize there's a real concern about handing over intellectual property, whether it be in the form of a process or anything like that, into the sort of AI arena. What happens to data? I mean, if you put in your PDF, for example, is it only used in the context of your question, or does it go somewhere? That's my question, really.
Right. So I'll start off with a slightly sort of dodgy answer first. So this presentation that you're seeing now and this tool set that we're using to talk to each other are out of our sphere of control already. So I've already uploaded all of my IP into Google. Right. We have talked about it and it's gone through Zoom. Right.
Yeah.
So we've kind of effectively lost control already. But there is another element with generative AI, which is we're going to expose it to a model. And what most people are getting at when we talk about this stuff is the model going to consume my data and then expose it to other people in the future?
Yeah.
Or is it going to get used as part of a training data set in the future? Which is incidentally already happening a lot, and lots of people are very upset about it. But the only real way you're going to know whether that's true, so first of all, you have to have a level of trust, right? Like in the same way I trust Google not to, I don't know what they do with my slides, but let's say they wanted to, like they have them, they're on their machines,
Yeah.
AWS has everything else. I mean, I guess all our money's digital, isn't it? So anyway, but there is an extra level of trust, which is that model provider going to do something with my data? And the only way to really know the answer to that, well, I mean, is to be them. But beyond that is to look at the legalese that surrounds the use of these models.
Sure.
So I showed you ChatGPT earlier, right? I use a fairly expensive version of ChatGPT because the default with this, when you pay this much, is that they will never take your data. And I can control where the data goes. And the default is that all of my data will be deleted in 30 days. Unless I keep, like over here, you can see there's my history here. Right? If I delete my history, it will delete the data linked to that history. If I don't, it will keep it. So, but you have to know this, right? Like, there's at the moment, you look at the T's and C's. It's more than likely that if you're not paying, you're exposed to the data being sucked away to somewhere else.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the interface set that you use. So this is the standard off-the-shelf ChatGPT interface for the foundational models, and the foundational models are GPT-4 and all the rest of it. Whereas I'm using here, I'm accessing the foundational models here, but there's a whole other workflow that's holding my data. So you need to know where the data's going. So in this case, I'm hosting this on a tool called Railway and all that kind of stuff. So it's about understanding the solution architecture and where the data is going to be able to understand that clearly. So that's not a very simple answer, but the base start point.
That's a good enough answer, though. It really is, because it's difficult to get your head around. When we send a document into the cloud, we accept that there are certain limitations around the probability of ever being used. But if I wanted to, for example, run the financial metrics on my firm and say, am I going under? I'd like to think that it was fairly private.
Yes.
So no, your answer, Luke, is spot on. Really, there are pay options that secure your data, or your data is more secure.
Yes,
Great answer.
Exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. And otherwise, now read the terms. If you're Microsoft, you're probably fairly safe. Like, they would be really shooting themselves in the foot if they started to do, use proprietary data for stuff. They've kept well clear of that now. I mean, there's lots of other perspectives in there. Like, most of us have loaded up most of our lives to Meta and Facebook and those other social media things that I don't use. But
No, great answer. Thank you very much indeed.
All right. Anything else? I'll stop sharing my screen.
I found that it's been very, very interesting and informative, I would say. In the background, I did sort of type into Copilot because it was the nearest available option to me to create a policy for 42,001, and it's come up with something that I think is fairly close to the requirements of the standard. So quite interesting. Certainly one to go away and have a look at, and be interested to know your thoughts on it. But I think it's been very, very informative. I've certainly learned a lot from it. And I class myself as someone who's done little more than very basic tinkering so far with AI. But
there's a whole rabbit hole to go down. It's a whole rabbit hole.
But coming away from this, I'm thinking there are opportunities and threats to what what I do.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, yeah, I think everybody should be aware of what's coming. I think in the next 2 or 3 years, I think there's going to be a lot of disruption.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Right. Well, if there's no more questions, then yeah, I will say. Do you want me to disappear so you can chat amongst yourselves, or?
No need to disappear. I think there's the usual sort of housekeeping